There is a place in the far-off mountains of Oregon where trees grow so thick that they block out the sun even at noon. People there don't like to talk about it. In 1903, Crater Lake was a small town with only 300 people living there. They made a living by cutting down trees and hunting. It was a place where secrets could be buried as deeply as the roots of sequoias that had been there for 100 years. The story I'm about to tell happened in these wild places, where being alone changed normal people into something completely different. It's one of the most disturbing stories I've ever heard. It shows how far a family will go to keep their darkest secrets safe, and how far people can go. Two twin siblings made a choice that would shock any civilized person on a property 15 miles from the nearest town. But what they found years later, hidden in the dark corners of their home, would show that some horrors are much worse than anyone could have thought. Let me know in the comments where you're watching from, and if this is your first time on the channel, subscribe so you don't miss any more stories like this one. You'll need to be brave for what's coming next. The Oates property was at the end of a dirt road that wound through a thick forest for miles. Waldo Oates bought this land in 1885, when he was still young and full of dreams of building a timber empire. The main house was a strong 2-story building made from the logs he cut. It was in the middle of a 200-acre plot. People in the area knew Waldo as a quiet but hard-working man. His wife died giving birth to twins in 1884, so he had to raise Phoebe and Wilbert by himself. The Oates family lived 3 miles away from their closest neighbors, and even then, they didn't see them very often. The family made most of their money from the sawmill that Waldo built on the property, which sold lumber for building in the area. Phoebe and Wilbert grew up in a world that was almost completely cut off from the outside world. They were very pale and had hair that was almost white blonde and eyes that were very blue. They had a strange bond that made anyone who came to see them feel uneasy from a young age. They often finished each other's sentences and seemed to understand each other without having to say anything. The family's isolation grew stronger after an event in 1895 when Phoebe was 11 years old. When they did go to town, other kids made fun of her because she was so pale and shy. Waldo was so angry about how his daughter was treated that he decided the family didn't need anyone else. From then on, trips to town were even less common. Waldo started to notice things that made him uneasy when he turned 18 inches, 1,902. The twins were locked in the attic for hours at a time, and sometimes he would find them sitting there in silence, just looking at each other. They had gotten into the habit of talking to each other without saying a word, using glances and small gestures. This made it impossible for Waldo to join in on conversations. It got even weirder when Waldo found out that the twins had started sleeping in the same room. When asked, they just said it was natural and that it had always been that way. Waldo was a simple, religious man who thought something was wrong but didn't know how to deal with it. During this time, Waldo saw that the twins had started to read books that their paternal grandfather, who the community thought was strange, had left behind. There were books on genealogy, old treatises on family lines, and even some books on breeding animals that talked about basic ideas of heredity. Snow completely cut off the property for 3 months in the winter of 1,902. The twins grew even closer during this time, spending whole days together without him. They had set up their own schedule that seemed to keep outside interference out on purpose. Waldo went to town to get supplies when spring came and the roads were clear again. At that point, the local shopkeeper asked him about the wedding plans he had heard about. Waldo was confused because there were no plans for the wedding at all. But when he asked the merchant for more information, he found out that Phoebe had been in town a few weeks before buying white fabric and talking about a family ceremony. The merchant naturally thought she was getting ready to marry a young man from the area. Waldo realized that the twins had made this trip without his knowledge, taking advantage of a day when he was working at the sawmill. Waldo confronted the twins when he got home. What he found out would bother him for the rest of his life. Phoebe and Wilbert sat next to each other in the living room and calmly told their parents that they were going to marry each other, not anyone else. After months of talking and reading their grandfather's books, they came to this conclusion. It said that Waldo got very angry and quoted the Bible and the laws of nature, but the twins didn't react. People say that they looked up pure lineages in their late grandfather's library books and thought that was the only way to keep the family together as it should be. They said that many important families in history married their own relatives to keep their unique traits. Waldo said he would kick them out of the house, but the twins had an answer for that as well. They were the only people who could inherit the property, and they were already of legal age. Also, who in the area would really care about what happened on such a remote piece of land? They had thought about all the legal and practical parts of their choice. The ceremony took place on the property behind the house on a May morning in 1903. There was no pastor and no guests, only Phoebe, Wilbert, and Waldo, who had to be there as a witness. The twins found a legal loophole. It was hard to contest marriages that took place on private property away from the authorities, especially when everyone involved was an adult. The twins went to the main bedroom of the house after the improvised ceremony. Waldo was so upset that he started staying away from the house during the day and spending long hours at the sawmill. He locked himself in his room at night and tried to ignore the noises coming from upstairs. He started drinking more than usual to try to forget about his guilt and confusion. In the months that followed, things got more and more tense. Waldo saw that the twins had started changing things around the house. They put extra locks on doors, covered some windows with boards, and started digging something in the basement. When asked, they said they were getting ready for the future and the family they wanted to have. During this time, the twins also started buying strange things in town. They bought a lot of food that wouldn't go bad, building materials, and things that looked like they were going to be used to make changes to their homes. The local shopkeeper told Waldo that the twins looked like they were getting ready to be alone for a long time. In the fall of 1903, it was clear that Phoebe was going to have a baby. The news should have made everyone happy, but instead, it brought a heavy silence that hung over the property like a storm cloud. Waldo knew that any child born from this union would have to deal with the fact that it was not allowed. The twins became even more shy during the pregnancy. They didn't go out much, and when they did, they always went together and walked around the property in silence. Waldo started to notice that they were always whispering to each other, as if they were always up to something. The first baby was born on a stormy night in March 1904. Phoebe's screams woke Waldo up, but when he tried to help, Wilbert wouldn't let him in. The screams went on for hours, and then there was a silence that was even more scary. Waldo understood why the twins had been so secretive when he finally got to see the child. The baby girl had visible deformities, extra fingers on her hands, and a skull shape that was not normal. But the parents' reaction shocked him the most. They didn't seem sad or worried. Instead, they looked happy and almost interested in the child's strange traits. They say Phoebe whispered something about how perfect the child was, just like they thought she would. Wilbert just smiled, a smile that Waldo would never forget. It was cold and calculating, as if everything was going according to plan. The twins kept the baby in their room all the time, so Waldo didn't see him very often in the next few months. When he asked about the child's health, the answers were vague, and the looks made him feel like an intruder in his own home. The second pregnancy happened very quickly, only 8 months after the first birth. This time, Waldo saw that the twins were even more nervous. They were always whispering to each other and writing things down in a notebook that they kept hidden. During this second pregnancy, something strange happened. Waldo started to hear noises coming from the basement at night. It wasn't just construction noises. It sounded like a child crying. When he told the twins about it, they just said that the wind was blowing through some loose boards. The second baby was born in December 1904, during a blizzard that cut off all access to the property. This time, Waldo didn't even know about the work until it was all over. When he finally saw the boy, he was shocked to find that he looked completely normal. There were no visible deformities. He was just a healthy baby. But it was strange how the twins acted around this normal child. They didn't seem as happy with the second one as they had with the first. The child's normalcy seemed to be a problem with their plans, not a good thing. Waldo saw that the twins had started to treat the two kids very differently during this time. The first, who had deformities, got a lot of attention and care all the time. The second child, who seemed normal, was often ignored and left alone for hours while the parents focused on the deformed child. Homer Mixon first came to the property in the winter of 1905. Homer was a skilled hunter who was familiar with every path in the mountains near Crater Lake. He had seen smoke coming from the Oats chimney at odd times, like at 3:00 the morning, and decided to look into it. Homer was the kind of guy who had to figure out every mystery. He had fought in the war against the Indians and had the confidence of someone who had been in real danger. The strange sounds and unusual schedules at the Oats property, which was far away from everything else, made him curious in a way he couldn't ignore. The twins were very nice to Homer when he came to see them for the first time. They talked about the weather and offered him coffee. But Homer noticed a few strange things. First, he didn't see or hear any of the kids, even though he knew that at least 2 of them had been born. Second, the house smelled strange, not bad, but like medicine, as if something was being cleaned all the time. The twins themselves were even more disturbing. Homer had met a lot of couples in his life, but he had never seen 2 people act so well together. They often spoke at the same time, as if they were thinking the same thing, and when one moved, the other seemed to automatically follow. Homer also saw that the house had changed a lot during the visit. There were boards over some of the windows, new locks had been put on, and there was proof that work had been done in the basement recently. When he asked about the changes, the twins said they were making the house better for their growing family. Homer asked to use the bathroom and then took the chance to look around the house. He stopped in the middle of the hallway when he heard something that made him stop. The unmistakable sound of a child crying coming from somewhere below his feet. But when he got back to the living room, the twins were talking to each other like nothing had happened. The twins reacted right away, and in a scary way, when Homer casually said he had heard a baby crying. At the same time, the smiles left their faces, and for a moment, Homer saw something in their eyes that made him instinctively step back. They told him in a cold way that he must have heard the wind, since old houses make strange noises. That day, Homer left the property feeling like he had found something much bigger than just a strange family. He had lived long enough to know when something was very wrong, and everything about the Oats twins screamed danger. Homer couldn't stop thinking about the visit for weeks after it happened. He started asking people in town about the Oats family, in a quiet way. What he found out only made him more worried. No one had ever seen the kids of the twins. When asked about it, Dr. Clarence Benson looked uncomfortable and quickly changed the subject. Homer also found out that the twins had bought a lot of strange things in the last few months, like a lot of lime, digging tools, and, strangely, a lot of heavy rope. The local shopkeeper said that they always paid in cash and seemed eager to finish their business quickly. During this time, Homer started to watch the property from a distance while he was hunting. He saw strange things happening. Lights moving through the house at odd times. Smoke coming from the chimney even on hot days. And sometimes, people moving around the yard in the early morning. Homer's interest turned into doubt, and doubt turned into determination. He made up his mind that he needed to find out what was really going on at the Oats property. He was an experienced hunter, so he knew how to move quietly through the woods and watch without being seen. Phoebe got pregnant for the 3rd time during this time. In early 1905, the twins became even more secretive. They went to town often to buy things they hid before anyone could see them. Waldo saw that they were spending more time in the basement, and the noises coming from there were getting louder and more disturbing. This time, Waldo wasn't even allowed to see the 3rd child right away. She was born in the summer of 1905. He was shocked to see that the baby's deformities were even worse than those of the first child when he finally got a look at her. It was clear that the child was having trouble breathing and that their physical development was not normal. But what upset Waldo the most was realizing that the twins were keeping very detailed records of every part of their children's growth. They wrote down everything the baby did, measured parts of the baby's body, and talked about physical traits as if they were scientists studying specimens. During this time, Waldo also saw that the twins had stopped calling the kids by their names and instead used numbers or traits to describe them. He was very upset by the clinical and cold language used to describe the first as the special one, the second as the failure, and the third as the improved one. Homer went to the Oats property for the second and last time at the end of February 1905. This time, he didn't ring the doorbell. He waited until dawn and then walked through the trees to the house, moving like someone who had spent decades hunting in the mountains. Homer saw something that night that would change everything, but he never got to tell anyone. He saw something through a basement window that the twins had forgotten to completely cover that made him question his own sanity. There were signs of life in each part of the basement, which had been divided into sections. There were small spaces that looked like they had been set up to hold something or someone. Homer saw the twins moving between these areas, bringing food and water like they were taking care of animals. But the noises coming from inside the sections weren't from animals. They were clearly from people. And they were clearly from kids. Homer was horrified to learn that the twins were keeping their own kids locked up in the basement, like they were lab animals. Homer Mixon never went back to that property, though. 3 days later, when he didn't show up for a planned hunt with friends, people noticed he was missing. They set up a search, but they never found Homer or any sign of what had happened to him. They only found his rifle, which had been left in the woods about a mile from the Oates property. The twins looked genuinely surprised and worried when asked about Homer. They offered to help look for him and said they hoped he would be found safe and sound. At first, no one thought they were involved in the disappearance because their performance was so convincing. But after that, a dark story started to grow around the Oates property. People started to say that the family kept their secrets so well that anyone who got too close just disappeared. Phoebe got pregnant for the 4th time at the end of 1905, and the baby was born in the spring of 1906. Not even Waldo knew about the birth until weeks later this time. When he finally saw the boy, he saw that he looked normal on the outside, but there was something strange about how he acted. The child hardly ever cried or moved, and their eyes looked empty, as if they weren't paying attention to anything. To find out what Homer really saw that night and why his discovery sealed not only his own fate, but also revealed a horror that was growing in the dark corners of the Oates house, subscribe to the channel. The Crater Lake community was filled with a quiet fear after Homer Mixon went missing. It spread like an infection. People started to stay away from the Oates property and the area around it. Experienced hunters, who used to freely roam those mountains, started taking detours of miles to stay away from that area. The twins became even more secretive and alone in the months after Homer went missing. Waldo saw that they were starting to make bigger changes to the house. It looked like the basement was always being worked on. He heard building noises coming from there at night, but when he went to check it out, the door was locked. During this time, something scary happened to Waldo. He started having nightmares every night about noises coming from the basement. They weren't just kids crying. They were noises he couldn't figure out. They were sounds that sounded like moaning, scratching, and something that sounded like furniture being dragged. He always found the house to be completely silent when he woke up in a cold sweat and went down to look. Waldo also started to notice that his health was getting worse. He kept losing weight, his hands shook, and he had trouble focusing on his work at the sawmill. The part-time workers he hired said he looked haunted, like he was always looking over his shoulder for something bad to happen. At the end of 1906, Phoebe got pregnant for the 5th time. This time, Waldo noticed that the twins seemed especially worried. They would spend hours talking in hushed tones, writing notes in notebooks they always kept hidden, and going to town a lot to buy strange things. Since Homer went missing, Dr. Benson had been staying away from the property, but people who lived nearby started sending him disturbing reports. A lumberjack said that early in the morning he heard the voices of several children coming from the property. Some of them were crying, and others were making sounds that he said weren't quite human. A traveling merchant who got lost in a storm and needed a place to stay near the property sent in another report. He said he saw Wilbert carrying something wrapped in sheets to the basement early in the morning. It moved and made muffled sounds. When the merchant tried to get closer to help, Wilbert saw him and made threatening gestures to tell him to stay away. During this time, rumors started to spread about other small disappearances in the area. A young shepherd who took care of sheep in the mountains had been missing for 3 days before being found walking through the woods, seemingly with no memory of what had happened. He always grumbled about hearing voices in the basement and kids who shouldn't be there. In the spring of 1907, the 5th child was born, And this time, even Waldo didn't find out about it until much later. When he finally got to see the girl, he was shocked to find that she had even worse deformities than any of the others. The child seemed to have trouble staying alive and needed constant care. Waldo sometimes heard crying coming from different parts of the house, but when he tried to find out where it was coming from, the twins always stopped him and sent him somewhere else. They had gotten very protective of some parts of the house, especially the basement and some upstairs rooms. Benson found something disturbing while going through his medical records during this time. He saw that there was a difference in the number of births that had been recorded in the area. Based on the pregnancies he knew Phoebe had had, he figured that there should be at least 5 children living at the Oates property. However, only 2 were officially registered. Benson started to think that the twins might be hiding these kids for reasons other than just being ashamed of their deformities. Maybe they were doing some kind of research and using their own kids as subjects. Benson found out that the twins had started reading about heredity and human development, which made things even worse. They had ordered books on anatomy, and even some books about hereditary traits from bookstores in faraway cities. During this time, Waldo started to see big changes in how the twins acted around him. They began to treat him more and more like a stranger on his own property, making decisions without asking him and setting rules about where he could and couldn't go. Benson made a choice in 1808 that would change everything. He made up his mind that he had to find out the truth about what was going on at the Oates property, no matter what it cost him. He started to plan a secret investigation, using what he knew about medicine to figure out what the twins were really up to. Benson, on the other hand, was not Homer Mixon. He didn't have the military training or survival skills that the missing hunter had. The Oates twins had learned from the last time. They were ready for anyone who tried to find out their secrets. Waldo started to realize that his own place on the property was becoming less stable during this time. When he was around, the twins often whispered to each other, but they stopped when they realized he could hear them. He started to think they were up to something with him. Phoebe's 6th and last pregnancy happened in 1808, and this time Waldo didn't know much about it. The twins had stopped talking about their family activities at all, and they treated Waldo like an intruder instead of the head of the family. Waldo never got to see the child when she was born in early 1809. During this time, even more disturbing rumors about the Oates property started to spread. People said they saw strange lights coming from the basement in the early morning, and some said they heard what sounded like muffled screams. A pastor who was on a missionary trip through the area said he felt such a strong evil presence near the property that he had to take a detour of several miles. Benson, who was determined to find out the truth, started using binoculars to look at the property from a distance without being seen. He spent a few nights in the woods trying to figure out how the twins acted. What he saw made him very upset. It looked like the twins had set up a strict schedule that included going to the basement several times at night. They carried buckets, food, and sometimes what looked like clothes or blankets. Benson was even more worried when he saw them taking away buckets that looked like they were full of trash or other things they had buried in the woods. Benson finally decided in December 1912 that he had enough proof to start a more direct investigation. He said he was going to make an important medical visit that might help answer some troubling questions. But like Homer Mixon before him, Benson never came back from that investigation. 2 miles from the Oates property, they found his carriage empty, with his horses still tied up, but clearly scared. It looked like he had run out in a panic, leaving his medical tools all over the ground, but there was no sign of the doctor himself. When asked about Benson's disappearance, the twins acted just as shocked as they had when they were asked about Homer. They offered to help with the search and really cared about the doctor's health. But people who knew them well saw something different in their eyes, a cold confidence that hadn't been there before. The dark story about the Oates property got stronger after Benson went missing. 2 people had gone missing after looking into the family, and now no one wanted to go near the property. Sheriff Schuyler Tucker had stayed away from the Oates property for 10 years. He had heard the rumors, felt the instinctive fear that surrounded that family, and decided that some stones were better left unturned, just like most people in Crater Lake. But in 1913, he had to do it. The pressure started early in the year, when families from other towns started asking about relatives who had gone missing in the area. There were others besides Homer Mixon. At least 3 other people had gone missing near the Oates property in the last 8 years: a traveling merchant, a government land inspector, and most recently, Dr. Clarence Benson himself. Families were writing to the governor of the state, and Tucker knew that if he didn't do something, his job as sheriff was in danger. The people in the area were also getting more and more worried. People wouldn't go through the area by themselves, and some stores had stopped making deliveries there. People who walked by the property also told Tucker about strange things happening there. A group of lumberjacks said they heard screams coming from the house in the early morning. They said the screams sounded like they were coming from something other than a person. A hunter also said that he saw figures moving around the property yard at night. In March 1913, Tucker finally got the courage to get a search warrant because he thought there might be criminal activity related to the disappearances. He knew he needed solid proof to break into someone's home, but the fact that so many people had gone missing was enough to make it legal. On the 15th of March 1913, Tucker rode to the Oates property with 2 deputies and a county representative. The morning was cold and foggy, and the property looked even scarier than he had thought it would. The house, which had once been well kept, was now falling apart. The thing that impressed Tucker the most about the property was how quiet it was. There were no animals making noise, no birds singing, and even the wind seemed to stay away from that area. It was like nature had chosen to stay away from what was going on in that house. The twins let the group in on the front porch. Phoebe and Wilbert still looked young at 29, but there was something different about them. Their eyes were glazed over, almost like they were fanatical, and they moved in a way that made me feel uneasy. Tucker saw that they seemed to have been ready for the visit, as if they had been getting ready for it. The twins didn't seem surprised or angry when Tucker showed them the warrant. Instead, they just smiled at each other, and it was the same smile that made Tucker's spine tingle. It said that Wilbert calmly told them they had been looking forward to this visit for a long time. The search started on the first floor of the house. Tucker quickly saw that a lot of changes had been made over the years. There were heavy locks on almost every room, metal bars on the doors, and windows that were sealed. It looked more like a prison than a home for a family. Tucker found signs of the twins' family life on the second floor. There was a big bedroom where they clearly slept together, and a few smaller rooms that looked like they had been used as nurseries. But the drawings on the walls bothered him the most. They were detailed anatomical diagrams, complicated family trees, and plans that seemed to show how physical traits have changed over time. Tucker also found a lot of notes written in the same handwriting by the twins. The notes used clinical and impersonal language to describe the physical and behavioral traits of different children. They didn't call the kids by their names. Instead, they called them by numbers and traits. Tucker's first truly disturbing discovery was in one of the upstairs rooms. He found a 9-year-old child in a small room with poor airflow. The girl had serious birth defects, including limbs that were too small, a face that was misshapen, and a brain that was clearly not developing normally. The door was reinforced from the outside, so she couldn't get out. The child looked underfed and scared, and when she saw the strangers, she made sounds that didn't make sense. Her clothes were dirty, and there were signs that she had been living like that for a long time. There was only a small window in the room, and it was covered with boards. The smell was awful. Tucker asked the twins about the locked child, but they stayed calm and didn't say anything. Reports say that Phoebe said she was a danger to herself and that being locked up was for her own safety. Wilbert would have said that Tucker didn't get how special their kids were. Tucker told the deputies to open the door right away, but when they tried to get close to the child, she started screaming. It wasn't normal screams of fear. They were sharp and piercing sounds that sounded almost like animals. It was clear that the child could no longer communicate normally. The search continued to the ground floor, where Tucker found that part of the kitchen had been turned into what looked like an observation space. There were simple tools, jars with unknown liquids, and stacks of notes about physical growth and inherited traits. But when Tucker went down to the basement, he found out how bad things had gotten on the Oates property over the past 10 years. The basement had been turned into a series of makeshift rooms, each with a strong door and small windows for airflow. Tucker found a boy who looked to be about 8 years old in the first room. The child looked pretty normal on the outside, but when Tucker tried to talk to him, it was clear that he had severe mental retardation. The boy just stared and moved his hands in the same way over and over again. There was a girl in the second room who was about 7 years old and had physical problems that were similar to those of the child upstairs. She was in even worse shape, starving to the point of being thin and having open wounds on her wrists from the ropes that had cut her skin. She tried to hide in the darkest corner of the room when she saw Tucker. The third room was empty, but there were clear signs that someone had been there recently. Tucker knew the smell of death when he walked into the room. The floor was covered in dirty straw, and there were ropes hanging from the walls. Someone had scratched hundreds of marks on the wall, as if they were counting days or trying to stay sane. Tucker found something in the fourth room that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He found the body of a small child in the darkest corner, partly hidden by a pile of rags. The body was very badly decomposed, but it was still clear that the child had died in terrible conditions. The broken nails and desperate scratches on the wooden walls showed that the child had tried to get away before dying. The body was curled up like a baby, as if the child had died trying to protect itself. The twins didn't deny that the body existed when Tucker asked them about it. Reports say that Wilbert calmly said, "Not all specimens survive the process." Phoebe would have added, "Death is part of observation, just like life." It was then that Tucker understood what was really going on at the Oates property. It wasn't just neglect or abuse. The twins were watching their own kids on purpose and treating them like study subjects instead of people. The notes Tucker found proved his worst fears. The twins had been keeping very detailed records of each child's growth, noting any deformities, measuring their mental abilities, and even trying out different types of confinement to see how the kids reacted. One of the most disturbing notes said that they had tested one of the children's limits by not giving her food for certain periods of time to see how it affected her physical and mental health. Another note talked about how different kinds of confinement changed behavior. However, the most unsettling finding was that the twins did not perceive their actions as cruel or erroneous. In their sick minds, they were making important observations about heredity and how people grow up. Tucker also found proof of what happened to Homer Mixon and Dr. Benson in a different part of the basement. He found personal items belonging to both men, as well as detailed notes about how they had interfered with important work and needed to be removed to protect the research. The notes about Homer and Benson were especially shocking. The twins had written down the ways they tricked each man into a trap, like predators studying their prey. They learned from each event and improved their methods to stop future threats. Tucker also found proof that the twins had plans to grow their business. There were drawings of more changes to the basement, plans to build more confinement rooms, and even notes on how to get more test subjects. Tucker also found out that Waldo Oates was in much worse shape than anyone had thought during the search. The man was discovered in an attic room where he was almost completely mentally broken. He was dirty, hungry, and always muttering about noises in the basement and children who shouldn't exist. Waldo had tried to keep a secret record of what was going on by scratching marks on a wooden beam to count the days. His incomplete notes showed that he had tried to step in several times, but the twins had threatened him and eventually locked him up. People in the Crater Lake area were shocked when Phoebe and Wilbert Oates were arrested in March 1913. Many people didn't believe the news when it spread about what had been found on the property. The truth was too awful and too far from what most people think of as normal human behavior. The 4 children who lived through the ordeal were taken off the property in a way that made even seasoned deputies visibly shaken. The 9-year-old girl, who had spent most of her life in a cage, couldn't walk right and had other deformities because she had been in a cage for so long. The 8-year-old boy looked more like a normal child, but his mind was like that of a much younger child, and he didn't seem to be able to talk. He had started to do strange things over and over again, like rocking, banging his head against walls, and making rhythmic sounds that seemed to be the only way he could comfort himself. The 2 youngest kids found in the basement were in even worse shape. The girl, who was 7 years old, weighed less than 40 pounds and had infected cuts all over her body. She had a pathological fear of sunlight and would hide whenever she saw bright lights. The youngest boy, who was about 6 years old, had lost vision in one eye because of an untreated infection and looked like he had been through a lot of trauma. He didn't answer when someone called his name, and it looked like he had forgotten how to be a person. He ate like an animal when they tried to feed him, using only his hands. A female doctor from Portland who specializes in caring for children was brought in to look at the kids. She said that their conditions were the worst she had seen in 20 years of work. People thought the kids had been kept in captivity for years, maybe even since they were born, but their behavior might have been even more troubling than their physical health. It looked like they couldn't make normal emotional connections with other people, and when someone tried to show them love, they got scared or angry. They had developed odd habits and wouldn't let anyone else be with them. The kids also acted like they had been trained to follow certain orders. As soon as someone clapped twice, they curled up in a ball. When they heard loud footsteps, they automatically went to the corners of the room. Phoebe and Wilbert stayed just as disturbingly calm during the interrogations as they had been during the search. They didn't deny any of the charges against them, but they didn't show any remorse or understanding that what they did was wrong either. Wilbert told investigators that they had been exploring the limits of human heredity and that their children were unique study subjects because they were related to each other. He really thought that the birth defects and mental problems of his kids were useful information about how genetic traits are passed down from one generation to the next. Phoebe, on the other hand, would have called the conditions of captivity controlled environments that were needed for close observation. She didn't think that being locked up and alone was cruel. She thought they were necessary tools to keep things in check. During questioning, it also came out that the twins had been planning what they would do for years before they even got married. They had looked into how other families with consanguinity worked, looked into hereditary deformities, and even gone to places where people with disabilities lived to see how things worked there. The strange nature of the crimes and the cold, scientific nature of the criminals caught the public's attention in a way that few other criminal cases had. The Oates twins trial became a big deal in the area, drawing in people from nearby towns who were interested in what was going on. During the trial, the prosecutors showed proof that the twins had been planning their observations for years before they even got married. They had read books about heredity, written to people who had ideas about how to make people better, and even gone to places where people with disabilities lived to see how other people lived. The defense tried to say that the twins were mentally incompetent because they were alone and had wrong ideas. They brought in experts to talk about how being very alone can affect the mind and how being related to each other could have affected the twins' own mental health. But prosecutors showed that their actions were planned, deliberate, and carried out with care over the course of almost 10 years. Everyone agreed that the person was guilty of murder, aggravated child abuse, and a number of other crimes. Phoebe and Wilbert got life in prison. They still said that what they did was right, and that science would prove it one day, even though they were in prison. Waldo Oates, who was found on the property in a state of complete mental collapse, never got over the shock of learning the full extent of what had been going on in his own home. He was committed to a state asylum, where he spent his last years muttering about sounds in the basement and children who should never have been born. He died in 1918, still having nightmares about his family. The 4 surviving kids were put in special care, but their chances of getting better were not good. Years of abuse and neglect had hurt her body and mind in ways that were mostly permanent. The oldest girl never learned how to walk properly and stayed in institutional care for the rest of her life. The boy with mental retardation got better with special care, but he never grew up to be more than a small child. He learned some basic words and could do some simple things, but he could never live on his own. The 2 youngest kids had even worse fates. The 7-year-old girl died from medical problems 2 years after she was rescued. Her body just couldn't heal from years of neglect. The youngest boy lived until he was 15, but he never really got used to the outside world. He developed a number of debilitating phobias and died during a panic attack. After the trial, the Oates property was left alone and fell apart quickly. In 1920, a fire destroyed the house, which had been the site of so much horror. Some people say it was arson, while others say it was lightning. Most people in Crater Lake, though, thought the house just wanted to destroy itself. Even though the property was searched thoroughly, the bodies of Homer Mixon and Dr. Clarence Benson were never found. The twins went to jail with the secret of where they had buried their victims. They wouldn't tell anyone where it was, even when they were offered a shorter sentence in exchange for the information. In 1934, when she was 50 years old, Phoebe died in prison of natural causes. She kept saying that what she did was right, and that history would prove her right until the end. Wilbert lived until 1951, when he died after spending almost 40 years in prison. He never felt bad about what he did, never asked for forgiveness, and never stopped thinking he was doing important work. The story of the Oates twins became a dark legend in the Oregon mountains after the trial. The story goes that you can still hear echoes of what happened on that land on the quietest nights. Hunters who get too close to where the house used to be say they hear strange noises like muffled moans, scratching, and sometimes what sounds like kids crying carried by the wind. Some older people who live near Crater Lake say that the forest around the old property was never the same after that. In that area, trees grow in strange ways, twisted and sickly, as if the ground itself had been poisoned by what happened there. Animals stay away from the area, and even the most experienced hunters say they feel uneasy when they get close. The story of the Oates property lives on as a haunted reminder of what happens when loneliness and obsession mix in the quiet mountains of Oregon, where trees grow thick enough to hide the darkest secrets of humanity. The story of Phoebe and Wilbert Oates makes us face an uncomfortable truth. The worst things don't come from supernatural forces or things we make up in our heads. They come from how people can rationalize the unthinkable. Two siblings, who should have looked out for their kids, instead turned them into things to watch, thinking they were doing something good. The twins' coldness when they did what they did makes this story even more disturbing. They didn't act on impulse or in moments of anger. They thought that every action they took was planned, recorded, and justified as scientific progress. They made a whole system of horror, with categories, detailed notes, and even ways to get rid of things that got in the way. The kids who lived through it had scars from those years for the rest of their short, troubled lives. They never knew what normal parental love was like. They never felt safe like every child should, and they never got to reach their full potential as a person. They were turned into specimens in a makeshift lab, and their own basic needs were put on hold because of sick curiosity. The twins never showed any signs of guilt, which is probably the most shocking thing. They said until the end of their time in prison that they were doing important work and that their discoveries would help people in the future. This inability to see how horrible their actions were shows that they are fundamentally disconnected from basic human empathy. The story also reminds us how dangerous it can be to be alone. In 1903, Crater Lake was a place where people could keep secrets for years, where screams in the middle of the night could be mistaken for wind in the trees, and where people who went missing could be thought to have died while hunting. Because they lived in a remote area, the twins could run their business without anyone watching them. For almost 10 years, their property became a chamber of horrors. When we think about this story today, we have to wonder how many other dark secrets are hidden in remote areas. How many other families use being alone to hide terrible things? And maybe more importantly, how can we tell the signs before it's too late? The Oates property may have burned down, but the lessons from its story live on. They remind us to be careful, to ask questions when something seems off, and to never take for granted that civilization and morality will always be there. Sometimes the most dangerous monsters are the ones who act like normal people and do terrible things in secret, away from the eyes of society. The legend of the Oates twins warns us that people can be very evil, and that sometimes the worst things happen when we do them ourselves. This is true in the Oregon mountains, where the wind still whispers through old trees. The mountains of Oregon still have a lot of secrets hidden under their old trees. The story of the Oates twins reminds us that some of the worst things that have ever happened to people happened in the most remote places. If this story made you wonder what other secrets might be hiding in the corners of our world that we don't remember, be sure to subscribe and hit the notification bell. We go deep into the legends that won't stay buried every day. Send this video to someone who is brave enough to listen to these stories, and in the comments, tell me what other far-off places you think might be hiding secrets like these. Your ideas might be the next thing we look into when we go back in time.